Uh, yeah. How's it going? Are you enjoying today? Yeah? It's an awesome event. So I wanted to talk about what is Web3 because I've been hearing a lot of people confused. Not today, but in the past. Maybe today people have finally in this room gotten it perfectly and now know what Web3 is. And so I wrote this talk mostly for myself to kind of articulate how I think about it, how I've seen other people talk about it, and how I've seen the community as a whole come together around a set of principles and properties and so on. And the first thing to note is that Web3 is a part of a much larger phase transition that we're going through. And so there's a larger movement going on right now in the internet. Lots of improvements are being deployed. But more importantly than that, there is a very, very significant change happening to our species. And that's that we're going from a pre-computing civilization to a post-computing civilization. And most of us don't have a good understanding of what that means. We have grown up with the internet. We have gotten to know what it's like to live with the ability to talk to everybody else around everybody else that you know at almost instantaneous speeds. And it is very difficult for us to grasp what it must have been like for our ancestors, say, 100 years ago, let alone 1,000 years ago. So this is a tremendous thing that's happening to our species. And the craziest thing about it is that it's quite fast. This transition is happening it's happening both at a breakneck speed, and it also feels kind of slow to us. So it's this weird ambivalence between happening quite quickly and happening quite slowly. For us, year over year, we don't notice that much of a difference. However, decade over decade or 50 years over 50 years, we see drastic changes. So think about this phase transition hitting us in periodic waves. Things like mainframes, then personal computers, graphical interfaces, the internet, the web, Web 2.0, mobile, blockchains, Web 3.0, and more. All of computing has happened in the last, give or take, 80 years. Can you imagine what it'll be like 80 years from now? Can you imagine what it'll be like 40 years from now? That should be easier, right? Things are in motion now that are extremely difficult to predict, and we are playing a big part of it. The choices that we make in the technologies that we build, the properties that we give those pieces of technology, are going to have drastic implications, not just for ourselves, but for a lot of people in the future. And so that is important and sobering, and should give you a lot of responsibility. And you should also think about this in terms of not just affecting a select few people in the world. This is increasingly affecting most of the people on the planet. We still don't have most of the people on the planet with access to computing, but it's getting there. We're going to have billions of people more in the coming years. So increasingly, everything we humans do involves computing and the internet in some way. Software is eating the world. Old systems are being radically transformed. New systems empower us to do things we couldn't do before. And with each new wave of technology, we gain superpowers. But these superpowers are defined and constrained by those properties of our technologies, by those properties of software systems that we build. How they work, how reliable they are, how correct, how fast, how open, how accessible, how safe, how they fail, who controls them, how they're governed, and so on, affect us drastically. And not just us, but the people in the rest of the world who can't build these things yet because they don't know how to. You are part of a lucky few who know how to build these things. So it's more important for you to be very careful about what you decide to build. We need to make sure that these technologies we build are built as well as possible and to maximize all human capabilities, but also with careful attention to rights, to promoting the long-term flourishing of humanity, and to making sure we don't accidentally cause some catastrophe down the road that we could have predicted. If we can't predict something, well, maybe we get a pass. But certainly, we should be doing careful thinking around what we're building and what lies ahead. So with that serious beginning, you can now relax. It's OK. This has happened a lot of times before. Every single wave of computing is this heavy. Think about what you can do today. Think about what your capabilities are, and the people that build those things, and the decisions they had to make to build the things you use now. In fact, some of the people are in this room who built the last wave, so thank you for empowering us all, so strongly. And we will work hard to make sure that even more rights are afforded to people. Great, so let's get into what Web3 is. The most recent wave in this technological progress is Web3. It offers great new powers, but it also drastically improves existing structures. And in order to discuss it in detail, I want to go through what the progression to Web3. So first, there was the internet. That's the physical wiring and the network protocols governing how computers communicate with each other. That's the internet starting to get built in the 60s, 70s, and has been growing ever since. It was primarily academic and military at first, and then opened up for commercial use in the 90s. That's a big lag time. Of course, there were a lot of other people already connected and starting to use things like messaging boards and chat systems and email and all that kind of stuff. Then Web 1.0 came in, and that coincided with the commercial explosion right around the same time. And the web is just a document and application platform, right? So it began as just simple pages that link to other pages, clickable hyperlinks. And it was extremely successful. Most information available on the internet is made available through the web today. Over half the people on the planet use or rely on the web in some way. Most users of the internet use the web, which has led to them not understanding the difference between the internet and the web. These things are kind of hard to distinguish. So the internet is the wires and the connectivity protocols, and the web is the web pages, the web apps, the websites, the web browsing. Web 1.0 is a term used to refer to the web from its start in 1990. We back-calculated that Web 1.0 term, but it refers to the period between 1991 and early 2000s. During that period, the web was primarily made of static, read-only content. Web 2 came about in the early 2000s, as the content on the web started becoming more and more interactive. The key characteristic of Web 2.0 is the dynamic, interactive nature. It is often described as a read-write web, because users can read information or write and publish their own. Think of all the kinds of web applications that you use today, things in mobile, things on the web, all kinds of interactivity, all kinds of participatory systems, all kinds of networks. The social networks are a big part of Web 2.0, but there are other kinds of applications like that. Think about markets. Think about systems like Uber and Airbnb and so on that just plugged into Web 2.0 and created new economies. Now, with Web 3, what we get is trust. We get read, write, and trust. We are building verifiability in the core layer. And we're going to dig into it deeper. So if we squint at it, Web 1.0 was about linking content together across the internet, all static stuff. Web 2.0 was about linking programs to that content and building rich, dynamic applications across our devices. And what's going on now is that the relationship is getting inverted. We're linking content and programs directly to each other, bypassing intermediary organizations, removing intermediaries, and gaining public verifiability. So Web 3.0 is turning centralized apps into decentralized protocols. It's much harder to build a decentralized protocol. I'm sure a lot of people here know that. But it's really important because of the properties that it confers to the users of these applications. It's really taking what Bitcoin did to money and doing it to all kinds of services and applications. So let's take a deeper dive. And that's the internet if you want to look at it. It's really nice. Web 1.0. How many people here use these things? It's great. Yeah, it's funny seeing how many of these are still around. Web 2.0, lots of great applications there. Also, lots of data lock-in and data rent-seeking and data monopoly stuff going on. There's a really big problem with Web 2.0, which is the advertising model. The advertising business model is one of the trickiest things in the entire system, where it's created a massive economic pressure to just keep people engaged as much as possible and keep people on the pages. And hey, guess what? Things like content that makes you angry causes you to be more engaged. So all these systems are just optimizing for people to get angry. So if you felt angry in the last 5 years, 3 to 5 years, and you use a lot of social media, then maybe that's why. There's a lot of stuff not reflected here. This is just a subset of the activity that's going on. There's a lot of stuff in the Web3 world. And so this is just a sample. This is similar to Web 2.0, of course, right? Like there's a lot of stuff that wasn't there. So the thing to think about with Web3 is that it's really the confluence of a number of different things going on. Bitcoin kind of kicked open the peer-to-peer world again. It thawed the peer-to-peer winter, and it reminded everybody that we could build peer-to-peer decentralized systems. At the same time, or a little bit later than Bitcoin, but at the same time as Bitcoin was picking up steam, 2012, 13, a number of people started building what we now know as the decentralized web. That is a whole movement, a very significant movement of a lot of different parties that are trying to think, that are reworking how the web itself with browsers operates and changing the way in which we retrieve information and we process it. That seems really familiar. It sounds like part of Web3. But there's a slight, there's a lot of intersection and some differences. The big difference, I think, is that decentralized web and blockchains aren't analogous. There's a significant difference between the two. What blockchains do is that they systematize things like economics and law. And so software eating finance, software eating law, in a way that the decentralized web isn't doing that. And what's more, the blockchain stuff didn't start in the web. You can't really call Bitcoin the web. It was a protocol that was built to run separately. It did not work with a browser. People had to contort tons of things to make it work with the browser. And so what a big part of the Web3 work is to bridge these gaps, is to make things like the decentralized web and blockchains talk to each other, to make all the blockchain systems accessible to people, all kinds of software systems that will enable people to issue transactions, to use the protocols and the applications that are being built. I'll leave the last one as a surprise for later. A big part of all of this is verifiability. Making things verifiable is, I would argue, the key property in this entire space. It's making things able to be checked to be true. That simple thing unlocks tons of other properties. It makes sure that whoever is providing, if somebody's providing a service that's verifiable, you can check that they're actually providing the service correctly. If some service makes a guarantee that they're not looking at your data and they're doing so in a verifiable way, then you can check that. It's a really fantastic thing. It's kind of like the hyperlink. So when the hyperlinks were first invented, a lot of people didn't get it. Some people understood the massive significance of being able to just jump from one page to another in the computational media. But a lot of people didn't understand it. And this is kind of the same sort of invention. It's a counterintuitive thing. It doesn't immediately jump to use cases. And so you're like, oh, what is this verifiability thing? How can I use it? But so the way that you should approach it is to say, at any point in time, when I'm building an application and I'm making some sort of social contract with a user, where I want to guarantee the user some property, ideally you can make it verifiable. And if you can make it verifiable, you can build a much safer, much more resilient, and also ethical protocol. And there's a part of this whole endeavor which is, you can think of as open services. These verifiable systems are producing things like utilities, where we have some open source code system that gets deployed and then is deployed in some sort of open way where the whole thing is forkable. There's permissionless entry. It provides a service over time. So it's, think of Bitcoin or Ethereum or Polkadot or all of the, think of all of the blockchain systems that we know. There's some element here that's different from other systems in the past. It's somewhat autonomous. It's not exactly autonomous. A lot of people run it. But the economic model is what makes it drastically more reliable than systems that we've seen in the past in the peer-to-peer world. Peer-to-peer couldn't compete with centralized systems. Peer-to-peer couldn't afford to pay people 24/7 to maintain infrastructure or to scale the infrastructure as needs arose. But the economic models of blockchains enable you to do that, and that's extremely powerful. There's another part of the Web3 world, which is things like market protocols. It's maybe what underlies some of these open services, but it also allows people to trade all kinds of goods. Think of being able to create commodities out of things that right now are fixed resources, so things like storage and computation and bandwidth and all sorts of stuff like that. Software is eating the world, and as the internet, this new technology, Web3 and blockchains, will fundamentally change how we collaborate, how we build businesses, how we design governance systems, how we operate global organizations. Software is eating economics, software is eating law, and these two things are going to have drastic implications in all kinds of systems, but it's kind of far out. It's one of those things that when the technology first arrives, some set of people might see the future, they start trying to build it, the first thing looks really clunky, they kind of do some trivial things like, oh yeah, I can build a little contract and I can move an asset around and maybe I can give somebody a digital asset. But the amazing thing about this whole smart contract system is that it's the basis of a jurisdiction. It's a proto-jurisdiction. It's computable law, and it's native to the internet. It's an extremely powerful thing. And I don't think we're even going to tap the potential of that for many years to come. And so I would say if you want to improve the future, if you want to bake rights into the system, if you want to lock the web open, as the decentralized web movement wants to do, then think about how to encode it into the jurisdiction of the internet, which is these blockchain systems. In a way, the internet is becoming a nation. It's like this weird thing. Who here remembers John Perry Barlow and the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace? A number of people. For all of you who did not raise your hand, you have to see that. It's a really critical thing. It's this amazing declaration of how cyberspace and the internet are different from the normal meat space world. And there's some time lag between the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace and now, but it seems like we're getting a jurisdiction now, at least a very, very simple one. And over time, that's going to pick up steam. So this might be 5 years, it might be 15 years, but in time, this thing is quite powerful and will assert itself. And so we have to think very carefully about what things we build into it, what kind of properties we put in place. Right now, there's a fork in the road. We could go towards things that seem very safe right now and extremely privacy heavy, but that make a completely opaque system that nobody can see or control, which sounds great, right? Like all of us are kind of for that. But what dangers lie ahead? Maybe those things might actually accidentally cause other catastrophes. So we should think very carefully. And we should still, if we think about all of that, and we still think that this is preferable to the alternatives, where the alternatives might be things like, techno-totalitarianism. There's a whole other talk there of how the things that we're building now, things like machine learning and robotics and all that kind of stuff, are building the tools of the state in a terrifying way. There's these two crazy alternatives, and we have to think as far ahead as we can and decide, and then bake in the rights now to lock the web open, to make sure that people can communicate and can associate, can be protected. And it's up to us. This is Gav's description of Web 3.0. Gav is, I think, one of the leading people who have coined the Web 3.0 movement. So Web3 is an inclusive set of protocols to provide building blocks for application makers. These building blocks present a whole new way of creating applications, things different from the way that technologies are built today. These technologies give users strong and verifiable guarantees about the information they're receiving, what information they are giving away, and what they are paying and what they are receiving in return. And this is, I think, one of my favorite lines. Consider Web3 to be an executable Magna Carta, the foundation of the freedom of the individual against the arbitrary authority of the despot. That's great. Talk about jurisdiction, right? I was kind of playing around with the idea of what if Wikipedia had an extensive entry on Web3. This is my take on it. And try to be as broad and comprehensive as possible so that people that are completely unfamiliar with the system can kind of approach it. So Web3 is a broad movement and a group of associated technologies and people aiming to make the web and the internet more decentralized, verifiable, and secure. The goals of Web3 include trustless infrastructure, things that you can use and trust without worrying that they might turn against you. Removing intermediaries, so not having to trust that some party is not going to become a rent seeker in the future. And giving users power and ownership over their data, identity, security, and transactions. There's probably a whole bunch of other things there. This is my take quickly. And very, very concretely, for those of us around here that are new to all of this and don't yet understand what all these technologies are, these things add capabilities and functionality for securely linking data and programs. So again, authenticated links between data and programs executing somewhere. They add verifiability, and they cause autonomous transaction processing. Peer-to-peer connectivity, so that means all our devices should be able to interact with each other. All our devices should be able to interact with people in the other side of the globe directly without dealing with intermediaries. And trustless interoperability. So this is a really key point that I think Polkadot as a project is far ahead than a lot of other parties. libp2p, a project that I work on, is also in that direction, where it should be great to build systems that can automatically interoperate without requiring any kind of conversation between parties, without requiring any kind of deal or any kind of systematic thing to be built. These things should work in the open. There should be infrastructure that anybody can plug into and use trustlessly. At the end of the day, all this Web3 stuff, this cloud of buzzwords, what it does is it provides decentralized computation and storage, which is really all you need for computing, and it enables fully autonomous applications, things that will run whether or not you're there to run them in the future. That's a very important property that no system in the past had. All systems in the past had to be maintained by some organization, by some group of people that cared about continuing to run this thing. Now, how can that be? How is it possible? Well, very strong economic incentives. So Bitcoin is about verifiability. Ethereum is about verifiability. Polkadot is about verifiability. IPFS is about verifiability. That's a huge ecosystem, by the way. I saw this infographic. This infographic is amazing. It has two sides for each of the columns has two sides. One is kind of like the old world stuff, and then the right-hand side is like the Web3 or decentralized web project around it. And I was astonished to see so much stuff going on. I compare it to, say, 2014, just 4 years ago, and there might have been like 5 or 6 things there. So this is a very powerful movement with a lot of momentum. Let's keep it going. Let's aim it in the right direction, and let's see where we are in 4 years. Here, a zoomed-in view. Pause. What about the other Web3? What? So it turns out, if you do a Google search for trends, Web3 is not a new term. It's been around since 2004. And what that meant was the linked data semantic web. Who here knows what that is? A lot of people. Who here thinks that it succeeded in all its aims? Don't laugh. This stuff is important, and you'll see why. The dream that Tim had when he started that entire movement was to make all of this stuff much more interoperable, to remove intermediaries from the systems, to decentralize the control of the information. It sounds very familiar, right? His approach was different. His approach was around modeling ontologies and modeling data and building a whole suite of technology around connecting computers in the machine-readable web. But a lot of the goals are the same. This picture, this old picture, has Web 2.0, few large websites are specialized in specific content types. It'd be great to have many websites containing and semantically syndicating arbitrarily structured content. There's a whole other stack of technologies there with a big crypto box. Yeah, a lot of people didn't know what to do with a CryptoBox. Guess what? We know what to do with a CryptoBox, and so this is where we plug in. And see at the very top, trust is the big thing that this whole thing got to. Unfortunately, a lot of the linked data web ended up getting sucked into the major data monopolies. So it turns out that the most successful linked data systems ended up powering the knowledge graph and the Facebook Open Graph, and not really the amazing decentralized vision that Tim and hundreds of other people were working on. But guess what? These things take time. This is the history of hypertext. And this is not even counting ideas from the past. Hypertext was coined in 1965, and it took a very long time to get from there to the web, which was the first radically successful hypertext system. There were other important successes in between, but these things take time. And guess what? 1980, Enquirer, I believe that was Tim Berners-Lee as well. So the web was not his first project. So if you think that he failed with linked data and he's not gonna, that didn't work out and then he's gonna back out, absolutely he's not. And guess what? The battle must rage again. So Tim is at it again. And the important thing here is that Tim and the entire linked data semantic web world has a lot of the same goals. It's just that technology was different, and the technology didn't account for a lot of the things that we know how to account for. And so there is some important unification here that could happen. Not saying that it will, not saying that it ought to, but it could happen. And there's a lot of people that care about the very same things that we care about, just in very different ways. And so I think that the decentralized web movement and the blockchain movement and the linked data movement are part of Web3. And Web3 ought to support these three movements in their own goals. At the end of the day, what is more linked than a blockchain, right? Like, isn't that like the best definition of structured linked data that isn't going to go away ever? Isn't that kind of fulfilling the vision of the linked data world better than a lot of the linked data systems out there? So I hope that in the future we have a digital system that takes into account our rights, that takes into account how people use those systems and how potential problems might be created. I hope that we have a trustless, decentralized infrastructure that we can just use, that we don't have to worry that it's manipulating us, that we don't have to worry is a massive vector for propaganda, that we don't have to worry might own us in the future or might stop existing. How many services have you used that just disappeared? So I want to build a permanent and stable future with all of this tech. And I think a lot of the people here do. And to get there, it's going to require a lot of cooperation and interoperability and building sane protocols. Going back to, if you think back to that slide with a ton of different protocols, there's probably a lot of people there that are replicating work, that are doing the same thing over and over again. And while competition can be useful, sometimes spreading too thin will just cause the movement to fail. Remember that these things take time. If we go back to that hypertext thing, we don't want to be like one of the first avenues here, right? Like we want to be the last line. So it's going to take a lot of cooperation and a lot of interop. So I think take this as a challenge to think through the protocols and applications that you're building, and think about other parties and other groups that are building similar things, and consider working with them and bringing them to some sort of shared ground, build a standard, build a shared protocol, build a shared system. And the Web3 Foundation is a great group that can help steward that. There are other groups as well. And this is a large movement. This is a decentralized movement. So it's kind of ironic. There's all kinds of centralization that we must have in order to decentralize. But use it. Take advantage of it. There's a lot of people that want to help you. You just have to show up. I wanted to have one last note and talk about browsers, because this is something that I would love to see in the next year or two. In the Web 1.0 world, there were very few browsers. That's the whole history of browsers in the background, like the whole genealogy, lots of different things. Web 2.0 kind of settled on these. There's a lot more not shown here. Web 3.0 browsers are very different. Some browsers look similar to existing browsers, and they browse the web that way. Some browsers are actually a single web page that you go to in a server somewhere that connect you to the blockchain and allow you to send transactions. Other browsers are things we call wallets. Other browsers are extensions on your browser that add capabilities. So we don't really know what the browser of Web3 ought to be. We have a bunch of experiments, and we should have a lot more experiments, because the big thing here is that we don't have good usability yet. That is a major challenge. So I'll leave you with that. Help build a great Web3. Help build secure systems. Think ahead about the things you're building, and make sure you don't build something you're going to regret. There's a lot of people right now that really regret what they did with Web 2. So make sure you don't do that. And build a bright future. Thank you.